before we get into the discussion and the presentations, I wanted to set the context of sex work. I think the framing of the issue of sex work is critically important. On one side, you have seen sex workers to be victims, vectors of disease, criminals, immoral people. Immoral people, right? That is one, and criminals on one side of framing. The other framing, which the sex workers movements across the globe and India has started to assert themselves as sex workers, as informal workers, sex workers as workers through the construct of work. There's always been a rift with these two paradigms. One paradigm which looks sex work as instinctively oppressive, it's part of patriarchal gender violence, and the other paradigm which sees sex workers as a space of empowering sex work also to the construct of pleasure. So in this context, Neeti's and Anant's book, which I have here, Urban Undesirables, City Transition and Street-Based Sex Work in Bangalore, becomes critically important. This book nowhere generalizes nor romanticizes the issue. It is an authentic document of experiences which they have spoken to about 6 sex workers through a period of 18 months. The book also rewrites, retells the stories of sex workers, their relationship to the city, their relationship to urban commons and the different actors where they interact through the eyes, feet, and the minds of sex workers. So friends, now may I now invite Neeti P and Anant Kamath to do the presentation. Neeti is associated with the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, Bangalore. She works on issues on urban labor informality and focuses specifically on women informal workers and various forms and responses from upcoming alternative labor associations. And Anant Kamath is associated with the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. He works on the sociology of technology in India with special interest in the subaltern, concerns on inequality, urban transition, social mobility, spatiality, gender, and caste. And they are the authors who have kind of brought out this very critical book in the space of sex work and in space of academic research. So, Neeti and Anant, so may I request you, please. So, the session will be, they will make a presentation, then I'll request the other panelists. At the end, we will have about 40 minutes for interaction and questions with the audience. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for coming, and many thanks to our esteemed panel. The initial thinking about this book and about this whole work was started off in about 2015, that's about 7 years ago. This was part of a greater livelihoods project in the Azim Premji University, where both Neeti and I were faculty in the School of Development. And some of us were looking at domestic workers, some of us were looking at street vendors and so on, and we were looking at street-based sex workers. Now, that is why this the empirical work, the field work for this entire study was funded by the Azim Premji University. However, the actual conversations with the workers themselves and the organizations began only in 2016. And as we went on, we realized that at the end of the day, we should have a work that straddles the space between being a scholarly work and being a completely narrative account of things. Because we wanted to address, of course, to address those who are not part of the scholarly community, but at the same time, we wanted to make a strong contribution to the literature also. So as you would see if you see the book, the first 2 chapters are much more scholarly. The other chapters 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 are far more narrative. So we tried to we've tried to balance the two. Now, street-based sex workers have for long been an integral part of cities like Bangalore as an informal workforce. Urban Undesirables captures 3 decades of city change in Bangalore based on the narratives of these street-based sex workers. Now, just to clarify, street-based sex workers are those workers who perform in the institutional setting of the street economy, soliciting their customers at public venues without third-party mediation. These workers may, after gaining clients, move to secluded public places or private enclosed spaces for providing services. So whether it is the street or any one of these spaces, city spaces are places where people express themselves, their identities, their livelihoods, their culture, their hopes, their aspirations, their futures. And so city spaces are for everyone. But for the last 30 years or so, the very meaning of what is public space has undergone a dramatic change due to an evolving urban imaginary that has been inclining more towards an Anglo-American neoliberal capitalist template. Along with this, not just what is public space, but also who ought to constitute the public has also sharpened. Public spaces in the city have been cast as accessible only to those legitimate individuals and social groups who fit into this imagined city and who do not pollute its image. Now, cities like Bangalore are in a Dickensian condition, and with all due respect to Charles Dickens, these are the best of places, the worst of places, which bring hope, which bring despair, which are capable of liberating and capable of overwhelming, which offer solace, which offer turbulence. They are a heaven, they are a hell, and you can gain everything and you can be left with nothing. Street-based sex workers encounter all these clashing conditions, sometimes even within the course of a single day. But despite being a ubiquitous and integral part of the city, street-based sex workers are seen as unpleasant eyesores who need to be pushed away, and their existence needs to be denied altogether. Now, the dominant popular and policy discourses around city change in Bangalore have left them out because they have revolved either around the nostalgic or around the futuristic, with little in the way of appreciating this wide spectrum of people. So the purpose of Urban Undesirables is not to document a linear chronicle of the life and times of these sex workers, if such a thing were at all possible. This is about a people who seem invisible in the city, but are omnipresent and have experienced the city's change in their own distinctive way, which needs to be proclaimed for all to see and to understand. In Urban Undesirables, we chart out the experience of city change from their standpoint, which is quite at contrast with what generally constitutes the mainstream conversations about city change in Bangalore. Often, conveniently, lethargically, deliberately, Bangalore is misunderstood as an IT city at its heart, while in reality, that is just one layer of a metropolis that has multiple layers. But this invisibilizing and pushing away does not apply to everyone. Street vendors, security guards, lift operators, janitors, food vendors, all these are included in city spaces as legitimate workers or legitimate individuals. This is because there exists a spectrum of moral acceptability and legitimacy even within informal work, and street-based sex workers lie around the negative end. So they're blacklisted on two dimensions. First, they are undesired in the imagined city as serious immoral blemishes, perhaps even a hazard to the ideal public. And second, they are considered as worthless workers in the spaces of a modern city, and therefore they are the city's advanced marginalized. So the struggle for street-based sex workers in this city is not only with regard to their traditional battles of identity, individuality, and citizenship, but also now in their battle to claim their right to their city. Urban Undesirables stands in solidarity with this. The book aims at being not just an academic commentary or a documentation, but we aim this book to be a social justice project by redrawing, rewriting, and relooking Bangalore city and its change over 3 decades from the eyes, the feet, and the minds of the city's street-based sex workers. It's a result of years of ethnographic work in Bangalore among dozens of street-based sex workers and the organizations supporting them. And over those years of ethnographic work, we ended up collecting narratives from 5 dozen or more street-based sex workers, spending months visiting and revisiting them with the invaluable support of a research assistant who was practically the icebreaker ship to lead us through these understandably frozen waters and hostile waters. Now, we gathered oral histories, we gathered stories, we gathered statements, we gathered reminiscences from individuals or groups of sex workers. We assembled, we congregated, We collated, we reconstructed recollections, we reconstructed personal commentaries about experiences, about people, about artifacts, about spaces, and all the other entities in their cartography. We located our narrators, and mind you, we call them our narrators, not respondents and sample in the typical social science way. We located our narrators through various civil society organizations in the city. We scanned also, apart from these oral narratives, we also scanned through 30 years of media reports in newspapers about violence against sexual minorities that are housed in the newspaper archive in the organization Sangama, the executive director of which is our Rajesh here. So above all, Sangama is what stood as our principal guide, logistically, motivationally, and intellectually. Now, there is no distinct red light area in Bangalore, to use that term. Bombay has Kamatipura, Calcutta has Sonagachi, and so on. The entire city of Bangalore is one. We are all in it. We live in it, we work in it, we move around in it. The entire city is a red light area. So we could not do the whole of Bangalore city. So what we did is we chose locations that are geographically and historically focal for street-based sex work, according to what our respondents had guided us. These included the KR market area, the wholesale market, the Majestic area, the central bus terminus area, the MG Road area, the upmarket commercial area, and also the Pinya Yashwantpur area. Now, naturally, the million-dollar question is us and them. Us and them. Yes, of course, if I may read out from the book and conclude my part of the talk. To even pretend that we were perfectly neutral beings who were merely conducting inquiries would be self-deceiving. Even when we requested Prabhavati, our research assistant, to conduct the interaction by herself in order to narrow the cultural distance between us and them, her inquiries still ended up carrying our vicarious presence and its embedded inequalities. And we quickly realized that since we could never and did not wish to hide our inequalities and hide our identities and advantage, these glaring inequalities of privilege were to be accepted as inevitable. And so we would never be able to guess how they interpreted our inquiries and explanations. Our positions based on our inquiries by caste, class, and gender clashed at every moment of the fieldwork. The different spheres of advantage that we and our narrators separately lived and worked in our different purposes of life and work, the different ways in which we accounted for ourselves, all these were unconcealed and laid bare at all times. However, what pushed us all through? Sex worker, advanced marginalized, mostly non-literate, male, female, transgender, mostly Dalit caste, social scientists, cisgender, upper caste, metropolitan researchers hitched, and research assistant, working class, literate, subaltern caste, urban female. What brought us all together was that our concerns about redrawing the city and chronicling its change were identical. So we went back each day in our siloed and unequal worlds, but we regularly returned on common motivational ground. Neeti will continue.
So, while analyzing their experience in this city, we gained support from concepts around urban informality, neoliberal urbanism, gender, the politics of technology, and so on. So, the attempt here in this book, this Urban Undesirable, was not to bring out any new theoretical perspective, rather to gain support from an array of theoretical kind of scaffolding that is sturdy, but at the same time not stonewalling us within. So a closer look at the discourse around sex work, in fact, brought a couple of concerns, and the major ones being the confusion in their status as sex workers arises majorly from homogenization of sex workers, lack of legal clarity on some aspects, and also the reckless generalization among scholars. So one set, as Rajesh had mentioned, one set thinks of them as immoral individuals who actually needed correction, while the other set thinks of them as victims needed to be rescued. unfortunately, both attach dishonor to this occupation. Now, if you take a look at the popular culture, we can see that this has also been misleading in the representation of sex workers who are either provocative and immoral or are those who are saved by a hero figure. So, but interestingly, if you take a closer look at the sex worker movements in India, especially in 1990s, in that matter elsewhere in the world, we can see that these movements actually significantly help turn the narrative to recognize sex work as an occupation. And this is far from the archaic position that sex work is exclusively induced by poverty or human trafficking, or these individuals needed rescue, rehabilitation, or HIV or AIDS intervention. So the discourse now is steadily moving towards acknowledging them as informal workers in the unorganized sector of an urban economy. Now, in reality, selling sex is complex and contradictory and depends heavily on structures of culture and class. So, commercial sexuality is experienced in diverse ways by diverse individuals through space and time, and multiple social, cultural, political, and economic factors coil around one another, and ethnic and cultural histories are crucial to sex work. Also, we argue that street-based sex workers have as much an effective role as public individuals do. So a sex worker is therefore actually a political subject aspiring towards greater citizenship, as well as an empirical subject coping up with an extreme subaltern position. So sex workers and their work cannot be simply reduced to victims or immorals and as a black and white violent occupation. So their lives and livelihoods cannot be reduced to sex work alone, as they are people just like us who lead multiple lives as parents, companions, caregivers, colleagues, breadwinners, and so on. So there are undoubtedly, they are undoubtedly like countless other legitimate workers who choose and provide for themselves through this occupation, within which they indeed encounter marginalization, sexism, exploitation, and violence. So, we have observed that the major concern in this whole discourse is that if you take sex work, so the sex and work is a part of, when you look at sex work, should be proportionately weighted to understand how both are intertwined and bring with them pleasure, danger, and agency. So, while mapping the social and spatial ecosystem around street-based sex work in Bangalore city, we have noticed a full range of ancillary actors and spaces around them. And in this book, we have laid out the spatial and human cartography of street-based sex workers in this city, with, of course, the coordinates drawn from their histories and their experiences. So if you take a closer look at the spaces around the street-based sex work in the city, which include lodges, pavements, cinema halls, parks, eucalyptus and bamboo groves, parthenium shrubs, trees, lakes, public toilets, bus stands, shopping complexes, and so on. Now, if you look at the whole, the sheer sweep of ancillary actors orbiting around street-based sex work in Bangalore, which include lodge managers and staff, auto rickshaw drivers, bus staff, street vendors, small shop owners, public toilet watchmen, park watchmen, cinema theatre staff, security guards, staff of restaurants and eateries, health workers, researchers, social workers, and of course, the police. So, then we can see that for decades in the spatial tapestry of this urban space, mutual investments in social capital are what kept these ancillary workers as well as sex workers in relative coexistence with one another. So I would say another eye-catching feature of urban undesirable are some of these maps which we have provided here in this book. And the purpose of these maps is to demonstrate the stark losses in street-based sex workers' accessibility to their traditional sites of solicitation, service, rest, and recreation. So these maps are mainly, we are focusing on three focal areas. So this is actually majestic. And so now here we can see that if you look this first map, so what a chaotic, jagged and freer jumble of sites become nothing but obliterated black swathes that show the losses of spaces and structures to these workers. So this is majestic. And now if you go to MG Road, again we can see that this is how as far as the workspaces of these available to these workers goes, this is how it looks like. And then of course the KR market. So here we can see that the darker patches are rather less compared to the earlier two spaces, right? So we constructed these maps entirely based on the narratives of workers and their organization over these years. Now, in Urban Undesirables, we also explore, may I close this? Yeah. So we also explore in great detail sex work and the city image through technology. So we actually analyzed their experience with technology from three vantage points, that is mobile phones, CCTV surveillance, and native language television media. So, we have observed that the body politics that these workers have traditionally encountered, embraced and battled, and the politics of technology that these devices and mediums are infused with do not just incidentally affect one another, but actually mirror one another within this sphere of work. Now, let me just take you to the last chapter of this book. We have named it as Their City. We have been crawling all over their city. We have all been working, traveling, enjoying, and living in their work sites and their recreational spaces. Our footprints overlap with theirs when we traverse through their world. We are actors in their theater as customers, adversaries, invisibles, accomplices, well-wishers, and benefactors, adorning the garb of software engineers, factory workers, shopkeepers, food vendors, researchers, teachers, doctors, lawmakers, police, and other decent people. So the cartography of sex work is one of the shapes of this city. And the labor of sex workers contributes to running this glittering metropolis. However, they are cast as the unpleasant and the execrated, the threatening and the targeted, the invisible and the visible. We have to rethink how we assume the easily misused term, the public, as much as we need to rethink who the city is, what its layers are. These layers and their associated people are as much the city as anyone else. Bangalore is and was no Arcadia. But it is rightfully their city too, nonetheless with all its welcoming and homely griminess. So when we approach one of the senior members of Karnataka Sex Workers Union, when we were requesting her to be part of one of our earlier conversations, she told us, take us seriously. We are humans, we are workers, and we are citizens. Thank you.
May I invite two distinguished panel members for today's evening. Professor Sasu Esther Thomas is an alumnus at the National Law School, Bangalore, and its former registrar. For a span of 25 years, she's taught at the law school, built up the Human Rights Lawyering Project and the Center for Women and Law. Her areas of teaching and research are human rights, gender, and family law. And Professor Sasu has also been part of the activism circle in Bangalore, if I may so Professor, please, yeah. The next speaker is Professor Supriya Roy Chowdhury, was educated at Presidency College, Kolkata and Princeton University. She's currently based at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, where she's a visiting professor in the Urban and Mobility Studies program. She's published extensively on labor in the informal and formal sectors, global supply changes, the changing forms of labor activism in the era of globalization, theorizing class, urban poverty, slums, and migration. Currently, she's working on climate migration in the Sundarbans in West Bengal. Please.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, let me thank Neeti and Anant for including me as in this panel and also for sending me a copy of the book. My field is law, and I don't really get much of an opportunity to read anything as interesting as this, and I enjoyed reading it a lot. My only complaint about the book is that it has a lot to say about public toilets in every single chapter, and I'm sure there is a valid explanation for that. When I looked at this book and this issue through my area, that field of law, one thing struck me, that a lot of the research has been done in the context of the ITPA, the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, which is the legal system that we have on the point. Of course, we had a different system earlier, which was the Suppression of Immoral Traffic Act, which had a very abolitionist approach. And we've, I think, come a full circle, as Rajesh pointed out, where, this is a hotly debated area as well. In my area, that is law, I see that, there are no voices when it comes to changing the law. And in the remaking of the law, the voices of sex workers are seldom heard, even though we are talking about the laws that apply to them. And I think that is also true of the city. So the voices that are heard in the remaking of the city are really the voices of the citizens and the populations, the privileged, as pointed out in the book. And I think the sex workers and others really face the burden of these different changes. And I think it's very useful that the book looks at the changes in the city through a perspective that is not always looked at. And the maps that we saw for the first time, we see a map that we are not used to, a map from a very different perspective. And what I really liked about the book is that the language of the book, it moves in quite seamlessly through the language of the sex workers, through very carefully chosen direct quotes, and the very beautiful language that both the writers use, as we've just heard from their presentations, poetic at times as well. Now, Bangaloreans, those of us who are citizens or populations, as Neeti and Anant would call the groups with some power, will get a new perspective of Bangalore from the pseudo-invisibles that include sex workers and others. Now, in the book, we see a whole new thriving city, very different from the city that we are used to. And the impact of the physical changes that we see have an impact upon sex workers. The metro that many of us see as convenient to move from home to work is seen as an inconvenience, which takes away livelihoods. The breaking down of old theaters, which many of us think about nostalgically, with nostalgia, is something that for sex workers is a destruction of their workspace. And a fact is that we all know that public spaces in Bangalore have shrunk. But the book shows how much it has shrunk. It's not just public spaces, but also workspaces. Many of us have seen it in neighborhood parks that are closed for everyone other than the neighbors. But sex workers see the closure of public spaces as well. We also see an interesting look at allies and enemies, those who are controlling the spaces that sex workers work in. Of course, the police is always should have a chapter of their own. And the role that they play has not really changed from the older law, abolition law, to the newer law. And their power is really the power that they use to not just dole out public punishment, like booking under for soliciting and bringing before court, but private punishments, asking for money or meting out violence that they deem appropriate. But more importantly, having an impact upon the very spaces that sex workers use. They get to be gatekeepers, as many others, to decide, can you work here, can you not work here? And this gatekeeping has nothing to do with the law. We see that very often Bangalore has come together to protest against a new steel flyover or cutting down of trees, but we don't really come together when living spaces and livelihood spaces are lost. And I think this book makes a strong case for us to do something about that. Now, looking at mobile phones as a space to be inhabited or restricted by people was something very unusual for me. I'm not a Luddite, but even I had to wrap my head around this. And I was just scrolling down to see if there's anything any judges have said. And a few days ago, soon after I got heard of this book, the beginning of August, a judge had made a statement, in a very different case, which involved taking up of phones of some people, saying that, nowadays people live in this, meaning that they live in their phones. And it is a move from just being a tool of evidence or a proof of soliciting to taking away of livelihood and, trespassing into one's personal space. So I'm so glad you introduced that. And I enjoyed reading it and came to terms with it, even though initially I was, what is, suddenly mobile phones doing in a space like Bangalore. And I think Bangalore being, as you said, we look at it as an IT hub. And if it is an IT hub to some people, then certainly mobile phones should be private spaces for others. I think in one or two sentences, the COVID-19 pandemic has been mentioned, but one wonders, after the pandemic, when we emerged from our homes to the public spaces, how much lives of sex workers were affected. At the Center for Women and the Law, we do have a publication on the shadow pandemic, but this is not something that we have examined in detail. We also emerged to find that a lot of spaces had changed for us, and I'm sure it has changed much more for sex workers. And I do hope both of you will consider doing some work in that area, not too far in the future, and that we will see some future writing which will throw light on this. We are about a week away from celebrating yet another anniversary of the Navtej Singh Johar case, which read down Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, where we talk about where we celebrated consensual relationships across barriers. Many read it as consensual sex is something private that no one should have a right to control. And we hope for a legal system that will also remove barriers and allow for a consensual sex work without barriers. And we look forward to a city that is more considerate of the people who live in it and not just a privileged few. I also had in mind the last quote that was just read out, but I will not read it out again. But suffice it to say that this book is an interesting read, not just for, I think, academics, not just for people who love Bangalore, but for people who live in urban spaces who wish to have a snapshot of what cities mean to people who are not in the common consciousness as we see it. When I saw the topic urban undesirables, and I saw that the book had been written through a sex worker's perspective, it left me wondering, who are the urban undesirables? Is it them or is it us?
Thank you so much, Professor Sasu. May I now request Professor Supriya to. Yeah, please.
Thank you. And I actually think that this book really needed to be written, and Anant and Neeti are really the right persons to have written this, given both their academic backgrounds and their very obviously progressive politics. Let me just kind of try to distill some of the things which have already been said. And I'd like to underline that, which Anant already has mentioned, that in the last 2 to 3 decades, there has occurred almost a sea change in the way we look at commercial sex. And this is to see sex as work, and therefore to bring it within the framework of worker or labor rights, citizenship rights, welfare, and so on. So the book actually takes this forward in a very creative way by placing street-based sex workers in the framework of the neoliberal city, namely Bangalore. And a very important focus, which Sarasu has already pointed out, has been to highlight the transformation of urban space, which underlies the loss of workspace or even rest space for street walkers. This places street-based sex workers within the larger ambit of thousands of urban or semi-urban underclass who are affected by the hyper-marketization of urban land. For example, agriculturists who have been forced or persuaded to sell their land on the peripheries of the city, evicted slum dwellers, evicted street vendors, pavement dwellers. Each of these categories have lost out on property, livelihood, living space, and so on. We therefore need to see sex workers as part of this growing urban, semi-urban underclass who are at the rough edge of neoliberal transformations. And secondly, I wanted to say that, a lot is written about the inequalities associated with neoliberalism, but what the book really brings out brilliantly is the binaries that are posed, the shifts in the urban landscape towards the big and the beautiful, that is malls, 5-star hotels, gated communities, bridges, and bypasses. And it is precisely these dramatic changes in the space which takes away the ground literally, which the book shows very graphically, from under the feet of this vast workforce. Now, in the literature on informal workers and work, there are countless examples of how neoliberal urbanism has negatively impacted the urban unskilled, particularly women workers. So I, basically see the book as fitting into this emerging genre of critical literature. Where I think the book goes beyond is in the methodology adopted, which is that of deep ethnography, which allows the authors to not only dwell on the loss of opportunities and of work, but really the disappearance of a whole informal support system for these sex workers, whether it is the lodge manager, the auto rickshaw driver, the neighborhood vegetable vendor. And this loss of the community touches on the disappearance of the support system of the community. Finally, where the buyer and the seller of sex face each other in an institutional vacuum. The chapter on technology and mobile phones elaborates on this alienation very poignantly. Now, as I said earlier, the book belongs to the genre of feminist literature, which looks at and seeks to elevate sex work as work, and to legitimize sex work, so to speak. In this sense, I felt that the question of choice becomes of paramount importance. So Anant and Neeti have talked about this theme that sex workers are not necessarily trafficked women, not necessarily victims, and that while there is a line to be drawn between poverty and street sex work, the line is there, but it cannot be assumed. So the idea here, as I understand it, is to bring to this domain the elements of choice, autonomy, and agency, which is so essential for recasting the profession as one which is dignified rather than one which is eternally stigmatized, which is fair enough and very commendable. I kind of thought that the relationship between poverty, choice, and sex work probably needs more probing. And one question which came to my mind is that would anyone choose to be a streetwalker or choose to remain as a streetwalker unless forced by circumstances? And in this context, I felt that we probably need more information about who actually are these women. What is the origin and genesis of their entry into street-based sex work? That I thought would have been really enlightening, but I'm sure it's coming in the next book, perhaps. Also, what keeps them there, you know? For example, other members of the household, what exactly do they typically do such that the women have to continue in this profession? And as you have rightly pointed out, many double up in other occupations, domestic work, street vending, importantly, garment work, which is very predominant female occupation in Bangalore. Currently, we are doing a project on garment workers, female garment workers in the city. And in our interviews, what comes out is that each and every of these women come from rural or semi-rural families, could not get an education beyond high school, if that, because of economic difficulties. So the lack of choice in being in an occupation like garment sector was very stark, where, you know, wages are low, there is a huge amount of coercion and sexual abuse. What recognizing the lack of choice in sex work that would do is probably to underline the structural factors that prevent these women from accessing better opportunities for education and employment. And in the case of sex work particularly, the lack of choice is even more underlined because of the accompanying violence that attends the profession. Now, finally, I just wanted to say, Anant and Neeti, that a related question is the seeming uniqueness of the organization of sex work in Bangalore, where you very graphically say that the entire city is a red light district. And whereas in other cities like Mumbai, Delhi, and Kolkata, there are defined red light districts, these have a lot more stigma, as those who live in these red light districts and work through established brothels really live an entire life of stigma and bring up the next generation of, that is their children, possibly even as brothel workers. In contrast, street workers have a household to return to and may actually be bringing up the next generation without the stigma of sex work. And what makes Bangalore distinctive in this context is that street-based sex workers probably have, or very possibly have, access to other occupations. What allows this is the relatively higher economic development of the city. Both the garment sector and the services sector have offered employment such that sex work may actually be supplementary. And this you have delineated very effectively in your book. So the point here is that these overlapping structures of female occupation may actually be very interesting to explore as they offer insights into low-paid female employment in a city which is otherwise glittering with so-called development. So this is about it. And once again, as a labor scholar, I'd really like to congratulate the two of you on this amazing product, which, as Sarasu said, is sometimes poetic, but which is so deep in its understanding of the scholarly literature that frames it, and where the narratives are concerned, are so completely graphic with a lot of imagery. Thank you.
So, thank you, Professor Supriya. I think when Professor Sasu was talking, she brought in the impact of COVID-19 on the issue of sex work. And when the pandemic was at its peak, there was this study done by a foreign university which came out with some of the recommendations that sex workers are actually vectors of the disease. They carry COVID-19 because it's coming from the same understanding, right? Because sex workers were always seen. Sex workers, sexual minorities were seen as the carriers of HIV. So they came out with a recommendation saying the boudoir pair, which is a brothel red light area in Pune, had to be closed. And we have seen that the impact of livelihood on sex workers has been tremendous. And in fact, the Supreme Court and high courts of various states had to kind of come out in terms of guidelines. But there's something interesting which happened then. The National Human Rights Council actually had sent out the guidelines and circular where for the first time they recognized sex work as informal labor. Sex work is work. But immediately after that, there's such a backlash which they had to kind of take back that circular. And recently, a couple of months back, the Supreme Court guidelines in the ongoing petition with the Budapest Karmasari versus Government of India also kind of says that sex work should be kind of decriminalized, because in India, sex work is neither legal nor illegal. As Professor Sasu said, the ITPA, which is the Immoral Trafficking Prevention Act, kind of criminalizes certain aspects of sex work, which basically criminalizes the entire kind of profession. And in terms of Professor Supriya's thing, I think there are two kind of distinct things here, right? Because one of the things, because again, with my activism with sex workers for the last 1 decade shows that, see, the question is this: are there exploitative practices within sex work? Yes, there are. As much as there could be exploitative practices in domestic work, in mining work. But the issue is singling out sex work is the problem. And I've come to an understanding it's primarily to do about morality, because I think if you kind of probe deeper, it's about our own understanding of sex in terms of morality. Because of course, there are exploitative practices, but the way forward is to address those issues and not kind of criminalize sex work. For example, there's this huge thing in Nordic countries, in the global north, Nordic feminists kind of brought in this new legislation. You have it in Sweden, Norway, in France, criminalizing clients. So the next new mantra within the global discourse of sex workers, okay, it's not the problem, it's not the issue of sex workers, but it's about criminalization clients. But research after research, especially in France in 2017, in Sweden and Norway, has shown that sex work is further gone underground. There's even immersed kind of violence against sex workers, especially so with immigrant kind of sex workers in those times. So the sex workers movement is always kind of argued that sex work should be seen from the construct of work. It's part of our informal work. Yes, there are exploitative practices, there are violence. That doesn't mean that sex work is inherently violent or exploitative, but we need to address those practices. You know, in India, when sex workers activism, when the movement started to kind of build up, at the central of sex workers' assertiveness is there's a slogan in Kannada which said, Nanna Deya, Nanna Akku, which means my body, my right. It is about my agency. It is I who choose in this profession, and who are you to kind of take away that agency from me. So I think it's also important to kind of recognize the kind of movement. I think it's been about 1990s and post-1990s, we've seen this tremendous kind of movement where sex workers are asserting. And the interesting thing about this book is it talks of sex workers which looks at different forms of gender identity. Primarily, sex work is always seen as women in sex work. But what about men in sex work, transgender people in sex work, gender non-conforming folks in sex work? I think this book kind of encompasses and kind of captures the different nuances. So I think it was an interesting kind of frame to do it. I think should we kind of open, now we'll kind of open up for questions if there are any, if there's any particular panelist which you want to address your question to, please feel free. If there are any questions or comments, we'd be happy to address those.
So this isn't directed to anyone specifically, but just to extend the conversation that was just happening, is that I forget who the author is, but she wrote this book in which she argued that sex work should be called prostitution because while it is work, we can't neglect the fact that the work is exploitative, right? Or that it's taxing to the body. And this sort of deals with the nature of work itself, right? Where then privilege becomes the fact that you have time for leisure, for other things. Whereas work is work is what, work becomes how you have to sort of work the body to earn a living. And in this case, with prostitution or with sex work, you can see that these people don't have a lot of time for leisure, right? Or other recreational activities. And another but slightly unconnected question is that a lot of, I think, rural population comes to cities to be empowered or to have opportunities. And I think one of the enabling things is that cities have a certain kind of anonymity that they enable, right? Whereas villages, everyone sort of is very visible to each other. And in cities, because of this anonymity, you have certain amount of agency. So in light of that, what does the practice of mapping cities and making sort of gray, anonymous areas visible, what does that do? And how could that be problematic, right? Because suddenly what you can see is some criminal agents becoming more visible in light of the law, if that makes sense. So this is actually addressed to, so 2 questions addressed to anybody who would like to answer.
Yeah, we can collect some questions.
Hi, my name is Shankar. I was just thinking about the class differentiation within the sex workers. So, since we all live in an urban space, sex workers as a blanket term, but within sex workers, can we probably say a little bit of bunch as prostitutes, while there is also something called call girls. So there is a class analysis coming there straight away, because no sooner we hear call girls, it is not the sex workers probably we see in Majestic or Satellite Bus Stand or anywhere. So this class analysis, perhaps an immanent tendency of capitalism also, is very evident. So how did you face that? Or so what was the empirical observation? That's my question. Thank you.
Good evening. First of all, happy Gauri Ganesha to all. I liked what one of the speakers said. Who are undesirables? Is it the sex workers or us? I think we'll have to give credit to the sex workers because they were open in sharing their experiences to the writers or the authors. Probably if they have to write another book and if they have to interview a different segment in the society, like houses or offices or different industries, you may not get such open answers to write maybe a lot of books and on different dimensions. So I feel the sex workers in this book are not undesirables. So moving on, my question is, in our society, is this sex work illegal? Should it be made open so that there are no exploitation and no criminalization? Should it be made commercial? Of course, there is a downside as well to that when we look at the culture. But now that in our country, we have been open enough to discuss and even write books about, sex and, other legal and illegalities, it's time, I feel, that we come clean about being open about the sex practices, not just in the red light area, because it happens everywhere. So I feel there should be a change in the mindset of our Indian society, I would say, not the Western countries, because they're very clear about the expectations. So what is your opinion that in the future or in our culture, how we look at this sex work?
Yeah. We'll respond to these and then get back to another round of questions. Yeah. Would you like to answer that?
Prostitution and their whole agents. Yeah, so I'll first reflect on the first question about sex work and the exploitation, agency, and so on. So let me actually link this with Professor Supriya's comment about, when we think about sex work, we can see that, or during our interviews, what we have observed in our discussions with Sangama and many other organizations and individuals working for the rights of sex workers and sexual minorities and so on, one thing we could see that sex work need not be a full-time occupation for many of these workers. And we have identified a form of a triangle here where these workers were at some point part of garment industries, working as garment workers, and then they were part of domestic work or working as domestic workers, and there is a sex work. So I'm not saying they start their career or they start a work from domestic. I can't just tell you the direction, but we can see that at some point they must have done any of these, some of these roles. So the very question actually, when we have started our interviews and discussions with the sex workers, we were also thinking about how do they actually represent themselves and how do they look at these this occupation. But let me tell you, after one or two interviews, we didn't really dare to ask them that question, because they were telling us that if you consider this as exploitation, do you have any idea about what is going on in the garment sector? So where, if you look at our occupation and even to get our, the remuneration which we are entitled to, or even to take off from work even for a day, we have to provide sexual favors, where we don't have any agency over that. And then we have to, if we want to continue in that workspace, we have to succumb to that. Or even domestic spaces, how far you can say that, we are actually out of any form of exploitation, or we're being even treated as individuals who have equal right to use your washroom or equal right to use the same plate which you have your food with, right? So if that is the case, how can you say that this is the work, this is only one work where we need to be rescued, or, there are saviors out there to help us. So, and finally, she actually told us, if you want to save us from our saviors, So, and it was quite evident if you talk to the Karnataka Sex Workers Union and the people who need not be, playing the major role, but if you talk to some of these workers who are part of this organization, we can see that, as Rajesh had rightly mentioned, one thing which came out was that we have control over our body, and we can decide, and we can take a call whether or not to provide the service, and we can take a call about how much should we charge, and we can take a call about our workspace, and we can think about what should be the nature of our service. So that is one thing. And also about the workspace, yes, when we mention the street-based sex workers, it has its own challenges, especially when you compare that with red light areas or specified zones. But here the challenge, especially post-COVID, we had discussions with Rajesh and then we were asking, how are things? So one thing we could hear was the mental trauma or the mental health of these workers, because identity is a major concern here. So every day you come to the city and, and you live with your parents or your partners and your children, where your identity as a sex worker is known to the other members of your family, and you use your different phones so that these two shouldn't, the calls and the customers you're speaking, it shouldn't be revealed to the other family members, and that tension. And during the time of COVID, you're still under one roof, and always the tension and the trauma that whether my identity as a sex worker will be revealed to my family, will be revealed to my children, so that tomorrow when they go to school, will they be, will others recognize them as a sex worker's, children? Or whether my parents accept me as their daughter, as their son. So that is another mental trauma, and throughout your work, living and you're breathing and you're eating in that sphere, So that's one, yeah. I'm sorry? About the legality. Yeah, I'll just go to that, and then, yeah. So about legality, ITPA, that's the first thing which comes to a scene whenever we think about the legal realm as far as this sphere of work goes. But interestingly, the sex work is not illegal in India. I mean, I don't know whether I have the right, but soliciting, in the public spaces, especially 200 meters, you're not allowed to solicit 200 meters away from public spaces. So I remember our discussion with, in fact, Ake Padmashali, she was telling us that, if a city like Bangalore, if 200 meters is the limit you're thinking, all over, we are not allowed to solicit anywhere in the city. So that's where ITPA and the whole grey area and how far we can think about the legality and illegality comes to there, which was quite evident in Professor Sarasu's. You want to reflect on the other?
Yeah. So, see, the great part about cities is the anonymity, not just for sex workers, but for many more types of people. As far as anonymity goes, in our experience in the fieldwork, naturally, visibly and otherwise, transgender individuals and transgender sex workers could not be as anonymous as they'd like to be, even visibly, as you know what I mean. Female sex workers, some partial degree of visibility was possible, but it was male sex workers who could freely move around the city without anybody even having a clue that this is a male sex worker. I mean, I'm saying this in such a judgmental tone, but this is the kind of thing they told us. So much so that, of course, without revealing names and locations, we can say that some of the male sex workers had, government jobs. I mean, not in terms of, say, he was not the secretary of some department or something, but then he had a job in the multi-story building across Vedant Sauda. He was a regular working guy with 2 daughters and so on. There was this other person who said that, the anonymity is the best part. I can come here from Andhra whenever I want to, whenever I have some job here, whenever I have a little work here. In the meantime, I have my regular clients, I have my regular lodge, and nobody knows, and that sort of thing. The other thing about anonymity is that public space offers a certain funny, it's a funny continuum between being visible and being invisible. That is, you can visibilize yourself in a way, you can invisibilize yourself in a way. All right, so it is in a way an opportunity, but it is also a battle. Now, the police know exactly who street-based sex workers are. They have immense experience in locating them. So they can easily identify them, but then most other people cannot. So they have to battle between this visibility and invisibility, and the city, the public space being a theater of great possibility of anonymity, brings with it all kinds of mixed challenges. Which is why the second question on the class differentiation is associated with that. I'll take up that question also. So I just couldn't locate it, but then we've written it quite explicitly in chapter 2. The kind of workers we did not want to seek. All right, that itself should give some idea of the class. Now, just to have a, one of the things that we found very interesting was from a couple of MSM sex workers, that is male servicing male sex workers. They said that yes, we are male servicing male sex workers, but then we're not like the gays, And then we asked, we were a little saying, but what are you saying? We're not like gays. No, gays are the ones who stand with nice clothes outside of pubs on Church Street. But we are not gays, we are MSMs. Now, of course, they were not talking about sexual orientation, but then the gay as a term for an elite form of an MSM. Even within themselves, they have a vocabulary of class. Then, of course, we have, let me just say this, sex workers who operate exclusively via ICTs, exclusively via mobile phones, so they don't even appear on the street. We didn't take them because they belong to a slightly higher, I mean, I'm using these words very carefully, higher class of sex workers who operated as escorts either through agents and or privately. Those who worked covertly within private homes, massage parlors, pubs, clubs, bars, hotels. We didn't take them because they were also higher. Those who were involved in pornographic productions, we didn't take them. Those who were involved in sex work for drugs, that is sex work paid in kind, and those who did not do sex work as a ritual occupation, and therefore not only class but caste. So we eliminated all these, and we realized when we eliminated them that this is a sort of a strange hierarchy of sex work, right? And using Kimberly K. Huang's classification of Vietnam, we borrowed that classification. She's written a wonderful paper called, which is titled, what is that? She's just another dirty girl, or she's not another dirty girl, something like that. We used those classifications to also look at the hierarchy of sex work here, and we looked at the lower 2-3 strata. So there is tremendous class differentiation among them, which is intersected by caste also. All right. One last thing, how should society perceive sex work? I think we asked this actually to them. So what should we do about this? What would you like us to do about this? Not in a patronizing way, to get away from the saviors thing, like what Neeti said, the worst thing is they want to saviors. And they said, you know what you can do? Do you know what you can do? Just let us be. That's what we can do, and that's how society ought to perceive sex workers, to just let them be, like we all are allowed to be.
Questions?
An ethnographic study is frequently just an extended narrative. How did you stop? How did you come and find a voice that looked at all those parts and said, this is a story to follow? How did you decide this is enough, this is the end?
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting conversation. My question is, and I'm not sure if I got it right, but I think Neeti spoke about how spaces have shrunk, especially when you look at the maps. MG Road and I think Majestic have shrunk more in terms of public spaces for sex workers to operate, while KR Market hasn't so much shrunk in size, if I got that right. Were you able to really find the reasons for this? Is there some ways in which the city has evolved in different parts because of which you found this difference? That's one of the questions. The other is, I think, regarding the agency aspect of these sex workers. I'm not very sure if it's possible to draw a very strict line in the agentic processes of these sex workers, because to kind of divorce it from the economic realities that might have compelled them to get into sex work is one part which cannot be negated, even though they might be fighting now to assert their rights as workers, and also trying to find the public spaces to continue with the occupation. It might still have been a burdened agency to begin with, where you are compelled out of economic necessities to be part of it. So where do we kind of strictly demarcate the loss of agency with which, or burdened agency with which they might have joined the work, and then later on, transitioning themselves into establishing identity for themselves as workers, and also fighting for the public spaces. So how is it possible? I mean, some kind of time chronicling of their lives might be required, to kind of talk about that. So that was the other question that I have.
Yes, please. So,
Good afternoon, and I want to acknowledge the session we had. And one interesting thing I would like to ask on is I come from Kolkata, and when we are talking about Durga Puja, there is a very particular Hindu ritual that the idols of the Durga Ma is made from the mud of the forbidden areas, that quote unquote, that we call the red lights of Kolkata. This is one of the Hindu rituals, without which the Durga Puja is actually said to be incomplete. This is one hand, we are taking one perspective. On the other perspective, we are looking at there has been certain Muslim sex workers who have been denied to be buried just because they're Muslim sex workers. So we are looking at like two religious perspective here. So what role does religion actually play in sex work? Like when we're talking about the dimensions of capabilities, religion definitely falls on one of them. So do you think religion is actually playing any role in sex work, or is there any role that religion plays in sex work? Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, how do we decide when things are enough? In the ethnographic methodology, you realize things are enough when you start getting the same information again. So when you, after a point of time, it's not that it's not that things became dull, but at the same time, we realized that we were getting, in the sense, more or less the same experiences. You can say a certain amount of saturation had reached. So that's one thing. The second thing is that we had corroborated all the information we had with organizations, not only with Sangama, but several other organizations. And they didn't have much more to add. And they said this was it. So when we came to a point in which there was not much more to add, then we realized, okay, now it's time to take all this and do something about it. And very coincidentally, after that, the pandemic struck. So in that way, we had this ton of paper and a lot of time at home. So that.
So when we were doing our informal discussions with sex workers, it actually took us nearly 3 to 4 years to do this. So you must have heard that we spoke to nearly 5 dozen street-based sex workers, but it took us nearly 3 years. I think more than 3 years to collect all this information, because we were visiting them multiple times. So it's not that we just visited a sex worker in a particular organization once and left at that point. So that's where, and then on top of that, we were having kind of group discussions with them. So there were multiple ways we were collaborating with the information we were gathering and checking it. Is it, are we getting repetitive stories, or is it there? And then again, I'll just go to the other question. So whether collecting or information for over a period of time. Yes. So this is, we have collected kind of archival materials. That's what we have mentioned earlier, for nearly 33 decades. That is, so that means, so one side we were collecting oral histories from sex workers. That depends on the age of sex workers. So we have spoken to sex workers who are in their early 20s, and then sex workers in their 40s, and the sex workers in their 60s, So we were collecting the sort of people who was telling us that, so I came to this city when I was 20 and now I am 60. So I could see that this is the way the changes have happened here. And that's where the newspaper, so we wanted to cross-check, is it, so being researchers, so that sort of a tension is always there. That's where we were trying to link it with public discourse. So only way to corroborate it with the public discourse is either we have to go to FIR, which we can't touch. So other way is to look at the newspaper reports. So that's where we were kind of trying to bringing out this public discourse and analyzing it over the years. Now, coming to the other question about how do you actually capture the city changes, right? So here again, we used a term called Revengism. So this is again, as I had mentioned earlier, nothing new, but it is new in this part of the world. So Revengism actually explained the revenge at which cities and the people who have, the citizens in that way, who have the power to kind of keep people away. That is a section of people. It can be sex workers, gays, and people who need not belong to the decent, or people who need not belong to the conventional citizens in that way, So we could see that, or during our discussions, if you take somewhere like Majestic, so we generally ask them, how do you see the change in the city? So then we used to walk with them, and it took some time they didn't allow us. I mean, it's not that the first day itself we could walk. So for instance, a couple of spaces I'll tell you. One is that the lodges. So if you go to Majestic, we can see that many of these old lodges are no more there, or the existing lodges itself changed its name as New or Premium or Regency and so on. So they were saying that, see, these lodges and the lodge owners and the people who are working there used to work, much more welcoming. And now you can say that we can't go anywhere near. And they even told us about the change in the paint, So it used to be dark green, and so now just look at them. They want to give a different way of the whole appearance itself. Another one is cinema theaters, especially for street-based sex workers, and they just gave us the whole list of theaters. Look at that, your Kabali and your Alangar and your Nartaki, and they just gave us the whole list of theaters. None of them are there anymore. So that is another space they used to provide service. And then the public toilets. That's mainly for the transgender sex workers and male sex workers. So if you, look at, it's not easy to get the data, but in any city in that way, if you look at it, we can see the number of public toilets have come down. So that is another space they were telling us, and they gave us, you just look at this space, there used to be a public toilet, but it's not there anymore. And this public toilet, in a way, it's, people like them, this is the only space they can go and they can, attend to their nature's call, right? So in that way, that's where it need not be always to, to give service, but for their recreation and to meet their basic needs. And same way, the kind of tea shops which have changed, and parks are, we know now that if you look at any parks, they are mostly gated, and then sometimes you have to take ticket to enter, and there are boards showing that who can use this, the neighborhood watch groups, and the lakes are another one. In fact, some of the recent studies about the change in the commons in the city actually brought out some of these occupations or livelihoods which are missing thanks to this the beautification of such a common. So this is how we have looked at how these public spaces have. You want to just talk about why KR Market is less blacked out?
Yeah, because KR Market is less blacked out than MG Road, because if you take everything what Neeti said, that's happening less in KR Market than on MG Road. The revengeful reclamation of the city, what Revengism is much more in certain areas than other areas. But of course, KR Market, the process is now going at full steam ahead, so we may have more blacked out areas. All this, and touching upon something that Supriya also said about economic compulsion. Of course, sex work is an occupation that is chosen within a framework of economic compulsion, like every occupation is chosen. I understand the standpoint that the question came from, but if I can slightly detour and also answer the question, domestic work is within an economic compulsion. The delivery is, Swiggy and Amazon delivery is within an economic compulsion. Everything, who would want to be a domestic worker? Who would want to be, an Ola driver? I don't think anybody aspires to be one as something you want to grow up, you want to be when you grow up. It is within a framework of economic compulsion that exerts a certain set of choices. And therefore what we're looking at is not that sex work is outside of economic compulsion, but that very forcefully, that sex work is a legitimate occupation that is chosen in that framework of economic compulsion. So definitely economic compulsion is there, but sex work becomes this little highlighted thing because exactly like what all of us have talked about, and like what all of you know is that there's this funny thing of morality in it. So that's why it stands out in the economic compulsion thing. The last thing about the religion and sex work.
I think Rajesh can.
Yeah. I'll just say a word before handing it over to the best person to talk about it. Certain religions and to say certain religions is a bit clumsy, but then certain societies legitimize sex work by relegating it to a caste that is where the exploitation is ritually legitimized. All right? And certain societies, certain religions look at it as sin unconditionally, depending on where you are from in the world. So that the framework of not only the framework of sin, the framework of caste, the framework of valorizing and legitimizing exploitation, all that actually is what differentiates about the position of sex work in religion. But I think, yeah.
Our observation, we could see that most of these workers actually come from Dalit community, and quite, so I don't want to go deeper into it. I think you may, both of you may want to reflect more on.
We also shouldn't, always forget the elephant in the room, that is patriarchy. So, morality is always looked at from a particular perspective. And I know one speaker here spoke about whether sex work would be decent work. From a point of view of women who want to put food on the table for themselves and their family, it is decent work. It's others who label it indecent. And I think that goes for religions as well, which are, very largely controlled by men. And I think it's really sad that, the solidarity that one feels for sex workers would be much less than the solidarity one feels for somebody who has maybe been, caught red-handed, stealing like crores of money. And the police will definitely not abuse the latter person, but they would abuse a sex worker. And morality is a very tenuous thing. As somebody who's in the field of law, we know the law keeps changing. To sex workers legal, you put barriers like no soliciting. But we also know that morality or religion, for that matter, which are all subsets of culture, also change. They don't remain constant. So ideas of what is right and wrong or moral and immoral also keep changing. But for us, I think in a country like India, what is really important is our constitutional morality. What does the constitution say? And to the constitution, all of us and sex workers are all part of and all rights-bearing individuals. We all have the same rights. We are all equals. And I think that's what we really need to keep in mind.
I think we're also in an interesting kind of times, because if you look at just not India, but even the global discourse on sex work, it's also been impacted by right-wing kind of authoritarian regimes. You saw that happening in the US with Trump administration, with the SESTA and the FESTA legislations. Turkey, for example, when sex work was being part, and today in the last couple of years, you're seeing in Turkey the kind of tremendous kind of attack and kind of violence against sex workers. So, and also when your polity is very authoritative, when the emergence of right-wing kind of politics, and then that impact in terms of sex work is something which we are kind of seeing. So there's also a tremendous kind of backlash also with the abolitionists, because there's also this very cleverly people kind of conflate sex work and trafficking. See, sex work and trafficking are two different entities. In fact, sex workers have always said that we know who the traffickers are, so involve us in terms of that. But then, but you see sex workers inherently trafficked. All sex workers are trafficked, which is not true. I think just to end, there's a study which was done a couple of years ago by this group called Sangram, which they also said that, because other speakers have said, so when people get into sex work, they've done other forms of labor. About 60% of sex workers which they interviewed did domestic work. They did, they were street vendors. They looked at other forms of labor. They got into sex work for economic conditions because they saw sex work is also kind of economically kind of lucrative as a profession. And we also need to look at sex work in terms of the contribution to the economy. The International Labour Organization now positions sex work as a form of decent work, and have said the contribution to GDP is somewhere between 3 to 10%. In a country like Thailand, sex industry contributes about 10% to its GDP. In India, you're pitched at about 3 to 4%. So sex workers also contribute to the economy of the city. And this old thing is, the old struggle is sex workers, how do we reclaim our cities? How do we reclaim the space of the cities? And I think that is where it is. And I think we are running short of... See, in terms of, religion and sex work, it's a more kind of complex kind of thing. But yeah, but in terms of but I could say certainly in terms of caste, because most sex workers, at least in my interaction, 75 to 80%, or rather 70% of sex workers belong to the Dalit communities, belong to other backward classes and other backward castes. I think that's a reality. And we cannot kind of not go there. But then there's also this other thing of then use it to kind of then attack sex workers, because it's also used, because we have seen that in terms of, just to kind of give you a quick example to kind of wrap it up. In Maharashtra a couple of years ago, there's this huge, when there was this Bhima Koregaon incident in terms of where all the groups in Maharashtra are kind of collectivized in a place to kind of at a site of protest. And sex workers actually wrote to them and saying that, look, we would like to contribute some kind of resources, money to this protest. And they said that, look, we're not going to take this money because this is dirty money. When sex workers even wanted to kind of participate in that, because it was there, it was all over in terms of, I think, about 2 years ago. So there's also the other side, which looks at sex work as inherently caste-based oppression, in terms of based on certain kind of caste. So in terms of that, so I think we are running out of time. I would like to...
Yes, sorry, there are a few more questions. Maybe you could ask the panelists post the session. N. Jairam actually wrote to us over email and said, I had a comment and not a question during, and he says, in my experience, sex workers have been and are among the keenest of human rights activists. We know that among the frequent visitors and users of the meeting facilities provided gratis by the beehive of human rights lawyers and activists, the Alternative Law Forum, 122/4, Infantry Road, are sex workers' collectives. They not only attend their own meetings and protests, but those of other voluntary human rights and pro-democracy associations, such as of street vendors, bus commuters, manual scavengers, those opposing CAA, NRC, NPR, and issues such as Kashmir and Palestine. Perhaps without having read the 1993 Vienna Declaration, they know that all human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. Thank you.
I think Jairam has kind of said that. In fact, the Alternative Law Firm, I think Sasi, she's one of the co-founders of the Alternative Law Firm. Yeah, because that's what, right? Because sex workers have always been part of and contributed to different part of movements. I think the recent example I could take is the CANRC. Just a couple of days ago, the Bilkis Bano kind of case. So sex workers occupied Freedom Park, where in terms of protest. So this old coming together of different kind of movements is very critical in the times which we live. So I would like to thank this distinguished panel for such, I think, fantastic kind of discussion. And thank you, audience, for being here. And also we'd like to thank the Bangalore International Center for giving us the space to have this conversation going. So thank you very much.